So before I do get started, I want to tell you about our mission at the James G. Martin Center. As Donna said, we used to be the Pope Center, and now we are renamed the Martin Center. We're named after James G. Martin, former governor of North Carolina, with whom I got to share this podium just a couple of years ago. And our mission at the Martin Center is to educate citizens and decision makers in order to improve higher education. And of course, we have a vision of what that improvement looks like. We're dedicated to promoting knowledge over credentials, to restoring genuine liberal learning, and to ensuring that public investment in higher education provides value to students and to society. We advocate for transparent and responsible governance, intellectual diversity, academic quality, cost-effective education solutions, and innovative market-driven reform. And so today, we're going to be concentrating on a couple of those items that we're really interested in. Being a watchdog for the taxpayer and responsible governance. The Bennett Hypothesis, I think, goes to both of those items. So this is probably a graph that you've seen elsewhere. It's been popular. You know, this is our version of it from my report, but it's nothing new. You know that tuition has been skyrocketing. It's been going up faster than medical care, faster than housing prices, and a lot faster than the CPI. You know, we called housing prices a bubble because they were going up so fast, but tuition has been going up a lot faster. And the actual percentage, when I calculated this at the end of the third quarter of 2017, was about 1,335% since 1978, which is my beginning year. That was the first year that higher education got its own CPI number. But now it's more like 15 or 1,500%. So tuition really has grown in a way that we have not seen in other sectors. And so this is the problem that really motivates most of the research on higher education tuition. Why is it going up so much, and what can we do about it? And the reason that most people care is because it causes a lot of downstream problems. A significant number of students either graduate or fail to graduate and can't pay this debt off. I just saw a headline this morning that says, for the first time, the government is lending out more than it's getting back in payments from students, because students are going to the income-based repayment form, and they're not paying back as much as we would think. And of course, taxpayers are the ones who are footing the bill for that. Many borrowers are failing to make any progress towards loan repayment. I'm sure you've heard that default rates are through the roof, but it's even worse if you look at it in terms of who is making repayments. So 3 years after leaving college, only 41% of borrowers have both avoided default and paid at least $1. So that's a low bar. You've neither defaulted and you've paid the government back at least $1. And after 5 years, it's a little bit better because some people who left their undergraduate years and went to graduate school are back in the pool and they've started paying. So after 5 years, it grows to 47% who have not defaulted and who've paid $1. So even after 5 years of graduating from undergraduate education, less than half of students are making progress towards paying back those loans. So clearly it's a significant problem both for those students and for society as a whole. Society defined as taxpayers, but society also defined as the kind of world we live in. Students are postponing things like buying a house, having children, getting married, and obviously those are significant cultural trends that student aid, at least partially, is responsible for. So when I was starting the research for this paper, I had all of this in mind and realized that it had been 30 years since Bill Bennett made his prediction or his hypothesis, whatever you're going to call it. And his hypothesis he published in the New York Times in a very short op-ed. It's still available online if you want to read it. It's called Are Greedy Colleges? And in it, he said, if anything, increases in financial aid in recent years have enabled colleges and universities blithely to raise their tuitions, confident that federal loan subsidies would help cushion the increase. And he recently said that he still stands by these words. And I think that if you're familiar at all with economics, that this should be obvious. So think about the counterfactual. Imagine a world where no one lends money for education. No one lends money to students. In that world, only a very small portion of the population would be both willing and able to pay for the kind of tuitions that we see right now, at the tuitions at expensive schools. And we know this is true because about 70% of students do have to borrow to go to school. So it's only 30% who can afford to go to school without any kind of borrowing. So if those loans weren't available, schools would have to respond. It would be, in fact, a business necessity for them to respond because students would not be able to go. They would have to cut tuition in order to attract students. And that's the logic of the Bennett hypothesis. If students didn't have loans and Uncle Sam's money to burn, the schools wouldn't be able to demand tuition that is sometimes $50,000 a year. And in another way, using borrowed money contributes to the problem. And that's because students have a high time preference. A lot of people have a high time preference. They discount the money that they'll have to pay back because it's in the future. It's not the same as spending your money today. And this makes it easier for them to say yes to schools charging them thousands of dollars a year, more than they really care to think about. But since Bennett first came up with his hypothesis, there have been a few refinements, and there was actually some thinking already going on that made it easier to understand where Bennett's idea fits in all of this. So the first thing I want to talk about is Bowens Rule. This is named after Howard Bowen. He wrote a book in 1980 called The Costs of Higher Education. He was an American economist and a college president. And during his time as a college president and an economist, he started thinking about, well, how does higher education finance work? What are we really selling? What is it that people are interested in? Well, he said that the main goals of higher education are excellence, prestige, and influence. And I think you'll know that that's true when you think about the way that, say, U.S. News ranks colleges every year. You see the most prestigious colleges at the top of that ranking. Those are the things that people are interested in when they talk about which colleges are the quality colleges. And Bowen further observed that if you're spending on excellence, there's virtually no limit to the amount of money you can spend. I mean, why put a cap on excellence? We can continue becoming more excellent year after year by spending more and more money. And that money goes to a lot of different things. Sometimes it goes to more administrators, it goes to better buildings, employment of rock star faculty, expensive marketing and branding efforts. Sometimes it goes to athletic programs. But really, there are no limit to the number of possible ways you can make your university more excellent. And we see that every year when universities get brighter and shinier and have more famous faculty and better dorms, lazy rivers, you name it. And because of that, because there's no limit to the spending you can spend on to create that excellence, each institution always raises as much money as it possibly can. And tuition is just one of the ways in which it does that. Of course, universities will ask for money from alumni, they'll ask for money from states and federal government, but they also get a lot of money from tuition. So they'll, every year, raise as much money as they can. And the Bennett hypothesis fits with that third point. Raise as much money as you can from tuition if you have to. Even better if the federal government is lending money so that students have a lot available for tuition. And the last thing that Bowen said is that since universities don't have, most of them, a profit motive, that means there's no need to hold down costs. because you're not sending things back to your shareholders as you would in a private company. And that means in turn that universities spend all the money they raise. So every year we hear the same thing, that there are needs that the university has and costs will once again go up. The second refinement came quite a ways after Bennett had already made his hypothesis, and that came from Andrew Gillan, who was writing at the time for the Center for College Affordability and Productivity. And he looked at the Bennett hypothesis and he said, it's a little bit too broad. Let's refine it by looking at different types of colleges, different types of aid, and different types of time. You know, static, so what's happening right now, and dynamic, what's happening in the future. And he said, but by making those refinements, we can really get a handle on what type of student aid is causing the most problems, where it's causing the most problems, and how we can address it. And so with all of that in mind, I started looking at what the empirical evidence said for Bennett's hypothesis. And I apologize, this is the worst of it, I promise. So I looked at 25 different empirical analyses that were published anytime between 1987 and just at the very end of last year, that examined either the Bennett hypothesis or the relationships between student aid from the federal government, from private loans, and the student downstream, and what would happen with tuition when changes were made, or just the existence of different kind of programs. And what you see in this is it really should just be one really long table, but there's not room for that. So we've got two pieces of the same table. The first column is the name of the study itself. Can you see this at all? No. Okay. So I'll explain. So the first column is the study, and the next three columns are what kind of correlation the study found. Did they find a positive correlation, no correlation at all, or a negative correlation? And this is available online. You can download the study. You can look at these individual pieces of research if that interests you. And what I've done in the case of every study is to categorize it and to say, well, this study found that there was positive correlation, no correlation, negative correlation. And then the last part is how many people actually cited these studies, which is a pretty good indicator of what other academics think about the quality of the study. So if it's cited a lot, people think that it's a high quality study, that people really did their homework, and it deserves to be included in future analyses. So to give you just a quick rundown of what the studies said. So like I said, there were over 25 studies, and 7 of them found no effect of student aid on tuition at all. I'm going to call that the Bennett effect just to have an easy shorthand. So they found no Bennett effect. And 3 of those that found no Bennett effect whatsoever were among the earliest studies. So they didn't have very much data, and if you remember the graph I showed at the beginning, student aid or tuition hadn't really started its monumental increase at that point. But the other thing about those first few studies is that some of them lumped everything together. So they lumped student loans and Pell Grants and private student loans kind of all in the same boat, and they also lumped all different kinds of education together. So they lumped community colleges with prestigious private four-year universities. And so I think that the fact that some of those first studies didn't find a correlation really isn't too surprising. Of those 7 that found no correlation, one of them found no effect between increases in the maximum Pell Grant awarded and increases in tuition. And if you remember that refinement we got from Andrew Gillan, this is something we should expect. Because the maximum Pell Grant is actually fairly low, and the Pell Grant is targeted decently well. It's targeted well enough to people who actually have a legitimate financial need. So it isn't causing an excess of money to be available. It's just enough in many ways. And of those 7, another very recent one found no effect, and that one was one about law schools. And it basically said that having extra money available in the form of PLUS loans didn't affect law school tuition prices. And you can believe, one of many explanations for this. 1, law schools are weird. 2, law students are weird. Or 3, and this is the one that the author actually favors, is that law students, because most of them know they're going to make a decent return on their investment, were already borrowing in terms of private loans, and they just switched over to PLUS loans as a substitute product. And so it wasn't very surprising to find that there was an effect of increasing that PLUS loan limit, because all the students did was change their type of borrowing instead of increase their borrowing. The clear majority of studies, 14 out of 25, which is actually, it's 56%, found a positive effect of federal subsidies on the price of higher education. When I say positive effect, I mean it increased, not that it's a good thing. So federal student aid of some type led to increases in tuition in 14 of the studies that I examined. And that was for each of them in at least one segment of higher education. But if you look at all of them together, every segment of higher education has been studied, and at least one person has found an effect in every segment of higher education. The effects do range considerably, though. Some people find that the effect of student aid is to increase tuition just by a couple of cents on the dollar. Others find, back as far as about 1991, people said, well, maybe it's more like 50 cents on the dollar. We've gotten some more modern refinements that are now saying it could be as much on average as 60 cents on the dollar. And there are some studies that look at particular kinds of aid who have said it is more than 100% because there are some offsetting things that are going on. So if you look just at the effect of federal aid, federal loans in particular, on tuition, and you didn't have any of these dampening effects, we would see tuition increases of due to 100% pass-through. The federal government makes $1 more aid available, tuition goes up more than $1. So I think that the weight of the evidence is really in favor of what Bennett said all of those years ago. But one of the other things that came out of this research was to show that at different types of institutions, there was a different effect. The effect is most powerful at institutions that are either four-year private elite institutions, aka expensive institutions, and for-profit institutions who have really 100% reliance on tuition. So as the school's reliance on tuition changes, its sensitivity to this Bennett effect changes. So if you have, for example, the state of North Carolina backstopping your tuition and putting considerable pressure on schools to keep tuition low, it doesn't really matter what the federal government does. So if you're a public university, you've got the people of the state, the Board of Governors, and the General Assembly all telling you, don't raise tuition. That political pressure will act as a counter to the natural tendency to raise tuition. If, on the other hand, you are a for-profit institution and you have nothing other than tuition that is paying for the effects, then the Bennett effect is going to be extremely high, 100% pass-through in some cases. So looking at all of that, I took the next step, which was let's try to come up with some solutions to solve the problem of ever-increasing tuition due to the availability of grants and loans. And some of the solutions that we came up with, some are at the state level, some are at the federal level. But these are a few of the things that I think will work. Some in combination, some I think can work just by implementing them on their own. So the first thing that I recommend is to eliminate graduate and parent plus loans. So a plus loan, like it sounds, is what you can get after you've already borrowed the maximum of other types of federal loans. So this is a different type of federal loan. But if you borrow the regular federal loan, the Stafford loan, undergraduate and graduate students already have access to up to $138,500 in the regular Stafford loan. This plus loan is what you can borrow after you have already exhausted that. And so our first recommendation is to just keep the $138,500 limit is plenty. Let's not add any loans on top of that. So let's eliminate these plus loans. And one of the studies actually was a great experiment on plus loans. So there was at one point in the parent plus loan, Washington decided that it would be a good idea to limit the eligibility of parents to borrow for their students going to school. They wanted to make the credit restrictions tighter so that the lending would actually make a little bit more sense. And what researchers found is that when that happened, and when plus loans were less available to parents with bad credit, the institutions that relied on those loans the most actually decreased tuition. So it worked. Cutting those parent plus loans made the tuitions or the institutions who cared about it actually decrease their tuition. So we have some evidence that is one way to stop this Bennett effect from happening. The next suggestion I have is to the extent that we're going to, as a federal government, as a country, subsidize students' ability to go to school, it should be in the form of Pell Grants, not in the form of loans. And the reason for that is that Pell Grants are more targeted. The targeting isn't perfect, but they are better targeted to students who have significant financial need, and the maximum amount that a person can borrow in a given year is relatively low. And so it's a much better way of addressing need without having the Bennett effect happen, without increasing tuition down the line for someone else. The next thing I suggest is to change the aid eligibility formula. So right now the way it works is you apply to a bunch of schools. You apply to, say, UNC Chapel Hill, Duke, and several others, and you're a rock star, so you get in all of them. Now, what the federal government will do when you've filled out your FAFSA is to look at the cost of the college that you've applied to and tell you how much aid you're eligible for based on the cost of that college. So that means they're going to give you more money in terms of loans to go to Duke than they would to UNC. Well, that's not my definition of financial need. Nobody needs to go to Duke. So nobody needs to go to Carolina either, but they especially don't need to go to elite private institutions that charge $50,000 a year. So the recommendation, and this didn't come from me, this came from other scholars first, was to, instead of giving aid based on how expensive a college is, let's just give aid or look at the eligibility based on what the median cost of college is. So it tamps down the incentives to go to more expensive colleges. You get enough, you get to borrow enough to go to whatever the median is, and that's the amount we're going to lend you. We're not going to lend you past that amount. The next suggestion is to make private student loans subject to bankruptcy laws. Right now, they are really the only exemption to bankruptcy laws. If you declare bankruptcy, all of your other loans will go away. Student loans are with you forever, even private student loans, not just federal student loans, but private student loans. So I think that by making private student loans subject to bankruptcy, it means that banks and institutions who give those loans will lend much more responsibly. They will start to look at whether a person is a good risk, whether the program that they're going to is a good risk before they decide to lend the money. You know, are you borrowing to become an engineer, or are you borrowing to become one of many, many, many students who have a psychology major and no idea what they're going to do with it? The next suggestion is to end subsidies on federal student loans, and again, there is evidence that this is an important part. One of the studies that I cited and looked into said that unsubsidized student loans have less of an effect than subsidized student loans in increasing tuition down the line. Of course, teach students about borrowing and what it exactly means to have to borrow that money. This is easier said than done, because the amount of money that you're going to borrow, the amount of money that college costs, all of these things, people have been making efforts to make these things more transparent for years. Every college, someone on their website, has to have a net cost calculator. The federal government has gone through several iterations of transparency websites. North Carolina has a website that will tell you exactly how much you can expect to make based on your college major. But so far, there's little evidence that students are using these things. So I do think that we should continue every effort to teach students what it means to borrow $50,000, how much they can expect from their chosen major, how hard it will be to pay back the money, what interest means, you know, all of those things that go into being a responsible adult. But we've tried a lot of it, and it hasn't had the effect that I hoped it would. And the last recommendation is that institutions have skin in the game. This simply means that institutions bear some of the risk of the borrowing that their students are doing. And this is going to put pressure on the institutions, one, to keep tuition low, and also to stop their kind of endless insistence that enrollment grow every year. They will think seriously about what kind of enrollment they want to grow, what kind of majors they want to grow, instead of just focusing on how many students we can get in the seats, regardless of their success down the line. All of this you can find in the paper itself, which is called The Bennett Hypothesis Turns 30. It's available online. It was published online only. You can download it from our website at the link right there, go.jamesgmartin.center/Bennett. But you can also find us all over the internet. And on YouTube, we actually made an explainer video about what is the Bennett hypothesis. And so you can go check that out on our YouTube channel. And with that, I will take questions.